Hey everyone, welcome to the Takeaway Club podcast, where I talk to interesting people from across eclectic fields to learn about their stories, aspirations, thinking models, and pretty much anything else that contributed to their success in their field and help them get to where they are today. Before we jump into the episode, a couple of housekeeping items. Along with the podcast, we now have a Takeaway Club WhatsApp group where I share interesting content from across different platforms. Whether it is the new books I'm reading, other podcasts I'm listening to, or just random tweets or articles that caught my eye. If you're probably wondering or rolling your eyes at yet another content creator coming up with a WhatsApp group, I totally hear you and understand you. But anyone who has known me for even a short period of time know that I'm a bit of a drummer for the anti-attention economy movement, talking about it whenever I get a chance, basically. In fact, that is one of the reasons why I deliberated on this idea for a really long time before finally giving in to the ease and comfort that WhatsApp brings when it comes to sharing content. As far as the group goes, it's spam free, it's admin only, so you won't hear a lot of pings. It will just be me posting at most one time a day. That's pretty much it. So just give it a try if that's something that you would find interesting or insightful. You can find the link to the group on the podcast website, which is thetakeaway.club, or you can simply drop a note to me personally on Twitter at chrisbot, KRISBOT, or LinkedIn at Krishna Srinivas. If you prefer the legacy way of communicating, I do send a weekly digest of some of this content every Tuesday in an email newsletter, which you can find in the same places online. Number two, I'm introducing something called the takeaway files, which I'm really excited about. It's kind of like a dossier, or more accurately, a one pager on every guest that I have on the podcast. Um, a bit of summarization of what we talked about on the podcast, what I liked the most in that episode, or what I learned the most, etc. Pretty much like my takeaways from these episodes, if you will. The reason I am beginning this experiment is one of my goals for 2021 is to write more, and I believe this will be a great excuse to chip away at that goal and at the same time act as a nice documentation of these insightful conversations in a written form in addition to the audio format itself. The takeaway files for each guest will go up on the site around the time I publish the episode. And with those out of the way, let's jump straight into the episode. In today's episode, I have Roshan Cariappa, who has over 12 years' experience as an entrepreneur and operator at early stage as well as fast scaling growth stage startups. He specializes in doing the 0 to 1 journey and setting up cross functional teams. And currently, he hits marketing at Vymo. Apart from this, Roshan also hosts two incredibly successful podcasts: The Startup Operator, where he talks to founders and other leaders in the Indian startup ecosystem, and Bharatvaarta, a podcast that brings together diverse perspectives on matters that impact India and its people, where he talks to academics, entrepreneurs, technologists, and other experts. Between the Startup Operator and Bharatvaarta, Roshan has published over 100 episodes in 2020 alone, talking to the likes of Sridhar Vembu, Balaji Srinivasan, Ajit Pai, Amish Tripathi, Harsh Madhusudan, among other esteemed guests. You can connect with Roshan on both Twitter and LinkedIn at Roshan Cariappa. That's ROSHANCARIAPPA, Roshan Cariappa. Without further ado, let's jump straight into the episode. Hey Roshan,
Hey, hi Krishna, how are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to do this. Before we get deep into ideas and interest, I thought a good place to start would be a quick recount of your story so far for people listening. Of course, you have successfully dabbled with multiple streams, if I can say that. The keyword being successful. because it's easy to jump between things at random and without really leaving a mark, but that's not you. You're deliberate, incredibly efficient, and almost with a surgical precision. So let's begin with that.
Sure. You're being too kind to me when you say that there is any kind of surgical precision or that sort of a flavor to it, right? I mean, sure, there is deliberate effort for sure, right? Whether it's music or writing or off late podcasting and so on. There's definitely deliberate effort to pick up skills required for that particular domain as such, but a lot of this has been a bunch of a series of well-directed coincidences, I would say, right? So I stumbled into startups quite by accident. I spent very little time in an oil refinery in Jamnagar in 2008, came running back to Bangalore, and interviewed at the first a company that would basically see me, right? And thought that I would probably, do some time pass for a few months and then, move on after that. But then ended up staying at that company for 4 years, had a lot of diverse experiences, dabbled in sales, product marketing at uh, what I know as a startup. But then, I mean, it was just pretty much a small company, right? Then did a little bit of consulting, and then that consulting sort of evolved into a startup by itself, and dived into entrepreneurship, ran my own tech services and product company for about 4 years, and then pivoted into marketing full time with Vymo. So today I'm in a head marketing for Vymo, and that is my full time job. Aside from that, of course, I do have interests in music and writing, and off late I've been doing a fair amount of podcasts as well. So that's a little bit about me. Yeah.
Wow, amazing. So I got a chance to explore a lot of things you did. I've been following the Startup Operator podcast for quite some time. Uh,
Hmm.
but I one thing that came as a real surprise was your musical journey. Carrie got the blues. I was curious when I first came across the name. I think it was in your Twitter handle, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So it has a musical ring to it, right? I was just curious. I mean, I was probably too lazy to go check out what it meant. But
Right.
sometime in the last week, I got a chance to listen to some of your tracks. I think one of them was "The Man in a Bar," and a couple of one. It was beautiful. It was simply beautiful.
Right.
So
Thanks so much again. You're being too kind. So
no, I think
uh,
I'll probably add this to the show notes, and I'm just giving an accurate description here. I think anyone who probably goes on to listen to your music album will agree with me here. And you had actually put out a tweet on the same lines. Carrie
mhm.
got the blues is now Roshan Cariappa. End of an era, beginning of another. I'm just paraphrasing whatever you wrote there. So
Right.
that I thought it's an interesting place to explore, to
Mm.
start off the conversation.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll skip the personal attributes to this, but I'll talk about some broader things that could be useful to the audience, right? So um, I look at social media as a sort of, evolving eras, right? So you had the one era of, Facebook and Orkut, where you found your friends and you found your relatives and whoever online, and you wanted to be connected in their lives, right? So that was, I would say that, evolution one. Then you had evolution two, which was around content, around topics that you wanted to interact and learn about, and you found certain people of that kind, and you had all of these endless debates on Twitter, on Quora, and wherever else, right? And then evolution three, to my mind, is where media or new media or digital or whatever it is you call it, sort of acts as a leverage to whatever you're doing, right? So if you're a fantastic marketing guy, the whole media aspect could amplify that hundredfold, right? So if you're a podcast guy, I mean, the whole new media aspect could amplify it hundredfold. So of late I've become very cognizant, and I would say, over the last 2 to 3 years, uh, of this aspect of new media, right? And this is purely uh, basis my listening to people like Balaji Srinivasan. There's a good friend of mine, Ashish Chandorkar. He talks about this as well, and so on. So I look at social media right now as a sort of an amplifier, and I want the good kind of amplification, right? So I don't know, sometime back I sort of um I wanted to duck out of this whole social media game and not be present on anything. But then I realized you can't really avoid it, so might as well utilize it, right? So when I joined Twitter, I think I was early on Twitter, maybe 2009, I suppose. I just thought that it's a cheeky name to have, right? Carry Got the Blues, and incidentally, that's what the whole the album and the musical act also is called, right? Carry Got the Blues. But increasingly, I find that I mean, people know me as Roshan Cariappa, and so I sort of have to project that. I won't call it brand, but I should project that persona online, right? So that's why you saw the whole Carry Got the Blues is now Roshan Cariappa.
Yeah, it's a very interesting evolution, like you say. I completely resonate with what you mean. I think I'll probably at this point I'm rethinking whether Chris Bot is the way to go for me. But I think it has to happen organically. So
Absolutely.
probably maybe some half a decade away or something. Uh,
Yeah, I would not make it too utilitarian, right? So you should reserve place for serendipity, for quirkiness in life, absolutely, and call yourself Chris Bot if that's working for you, man. I mean, you don't have to always think of these kind of things
right.
in everything that you do. There's a time and place for it. It's just that I felt Roshan Cariappa was not too bad.
Maybe on the same lines, what are some of the traits or guiding principles that you set for yourself in your 20s, or maybe somewhat passively followed, that gave you a leg up when making these important decisions, whether it's being at a startup game that early, at a point when it was more like a reckless dive versus the badge of valor that it is now, or going on to do your own music album, and even when you look at podcasting that you do now. So there must have been some framework. I mean, it may not have been 100% planned thing, but what were some of the traits that were very specific to the way you did things and eventually let you choose the things that you liked and were good at?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, you're right. I mean, there's no grand design as such. And it's not like I set out, planning these things out 12 or 13 years back when I started, right? And a lot of this has just been, iterating with intent. A lot of people talk about hard work and smart work and things to that effect. And, I really feel you just have to apply yourself to whatever challenge you're solving and find the biggest juiciest problem to solve, and I tend to gravitate towards my passions. I mean, what is marketing but another form of writing? What is music but another form of expressing yourself? I tend to gravitate more towards that. And I think, somewhere it helps to have a certain amount of self-awareness, and self-awareness comes from a lot of self-examination. It's about being alone with your thoughts. It's about being true to yourself in terms of what is it that motivates you in life. What is it that you're good at? What is it that you're bad at, and so on, right? So um, it's that whole Richard Feynman principle of you are the easiest to fool, right? I was hearing that on a Naval podcast yesterday, and it still rings true, right? So as long as you don't kid yourself, I think you will probably do well in the things that you want to do, right? And uh, couple of other things is not being afraid to solve things by first principles. I learned this from Steve Jobs, right? When he talks about hey, everything amazing around you was put together by people no smarter than you, right? I mean, they're also made of flesh and blood, right? uh, so which means that there's no reason why you could not do all of those wonderful things. I mean, so have the courage to solve things by first principles, iterate with intent, be deliberate about the things you do, and surround yourselves with people you love being around, so that's one of the things that I was really, really fortunate to have early on in life, that I was surrounded by the most interesting, intelligent people, and all things weighed, I think I learn the most. And I think it's probably true for everyone as well, that you learn the most by osmosis. You learn purely based on who you surround yourself with and who you work with. And so that has been like a very key influence for me. And you know and this isn't just your peer group or whatever. I mean, it's the kind of managers you work with, the bosses you report to, the kind of older friendships you develop, so on and so forth. And have a diverse set of people that you talk to, that you vibe with, that you have a relationship with. And these things have a way of percolating in your mindset. So that's what I would say. I mean, I don't know if it answers your question. It's a long winding answer.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And yeah, I think I might have a follow on this as well. Maybe if you can say how much of this was actively trying to be and learn. And I know a lot of what you mentioned falls in the passive way of approach to things, right? Surrounding yourself with the right people, right? With the right managers, and all of this just happens to be. What were some of the things that you actively did in your 20s to learning things, right? And get better at what you did?
So looking back again, and this is some of it is just retrospective, right? I mean, looking back, there are three or four things that have made a difference. So again, I'm going to discount all of the usual things that people talk about, right? Like hard work and all of those things. uh, I always surrounded myself with people who are much, much capable than I am, right? And that meant being with people who are a lot older than I am. Like forever in my life, I can recount my friends being 5, 10 years older than I am, right? So I always made friends who are a lot older than I am. So I had that advantage, right? Growing up, where I had that context, I was always ahead of the curve in some sense, in that way, right? So which also meant that second, you kind of knew how little you knew about a lot of things, right? Whether it's life or whether it's something you're doing with work or whatever it is. So it kind of freed your mind in terms of, okay, not having to position yourself a certain way, not having to pretend, and not having to sort of put on an air of like, okay, I know this or I know it all. So which meant that you approached everything with a certain sense of humility, sincerity, and you wanted to learn whatever you applied yourself into. So that made a lot of difference. That made a lot of difference. I think Sadhguru says this as well, that once you say you don't know, that opens up a whole possibility of knowing, right? So uh, I firmly believe in that. And one of the things that I have tried to inculcate over the last 3 to 5 years is being really proactive about things, uh, and especially the hard choices. I happen to read this quote, um, easy choices, hard life, hard choices, easy life, something to that effect, right? It was by this weight trainer. Um, and that kind of stuck at the back of my mind. And it's also partly what the Seneca quote indicates as well, which is that look, things are going to happen to you, and you either you're either proactive about it and you do something about it, and you have some semblance of control about things, rather than wait for it to happen and then react, right? So those are three things I would say, I mean, looking back, that's made a sort of a positive difference in my life.
So coming to your podcasting journey, I've listened to your episode with Aviral, JPK, which I absolutely love for the journey that he had. And of course, you run two podcasts, right? The Startup Operator and Bharatvaarta, which when you look at it, they're very two contrasting genres, right? And I believe they require completely different mindsets in the lead up to the conversation. At least that's how it looks from on the outside. Uh, what difference does it make for you when you get into a startup operator episode versus one for Bharatvaarta? Is there any difference at all? If so, what is it, and how do you go about adjusting your mindset or framework for either of the episodes?
Good question again. So, yes, there are some differences, but there's a lot of commonality as well. So, there are some common principles in terms of, hey, do your homework on the topic, on the guests, figure out what you want out of it. Because as a podcaster, you're sort of being a director, right? I mean, you are directing content in some sense, right? Then there are the elements of scheduling, recording, distribution, so on and so forth, which I'm sure you know about as well, that come to bear. So those are some common things that you have to do irrespective of what podcast it is. Um, I started Startup Operator for a different reason as opposed to Bharatvaarta, right? So maybe I can begin with Bharatvaarta and explain why we started this, right? So uh, we're all part of many different WhatsApp groups, and we discuss social, political, cultural issues. We go back and forth with our friends, relatives, what have you. Um, and often we don't get to a point where either of us understand anything about what was being discussed, right? It somehow devolves into very terse, either sort of a name calling or like one-upmanship. It's pretty hopeless, right? There is no point of learning in any of these interactions, and I sort of sense that, I mean, there has to be a better way to sort of understand some of these topics, right? Everything is a little complex, a lot more complex than, what people think it to be, especially things that are of consequence, right? Politics and, so on and so forth, right? So Bharatvarta, I started with a few friends of mine to really unravel some of these subjects in a long form conversation, right? And we focus on politics, policy, and culture focused on India, right? So we talk about variety of things. I mean, we talk about education, economy, and we have very diverse perspectives. These are, people very well established in their own chosen fields, uh, who have, who have the content to bring forth, right? I mean, who sort of bring forth the kind of content that makes it pretty exciting. I mean, these are not people who are there just because of their credentials, but they actually have very interesting things to talk about and discover as well. So, really, all I wanted to do was, understand more about, a bunch of things that are happening in the world, and especially about India. And I get to do that with Bharatvarta. With Startup Operator, uh, really, I mean, I just wanted to keep in touch with whatever's happening in the startup ecosystem, right? Things tend to change a lot, and there are really, really some amazing operators, founders, investors that we could all learn from. And Startup Operator is my sort of a ruse to engage with these people, learn from them, connect with them, and so on, right? So you know the mindset is sort of different with Startup Operator, because here I have a lot more context, I would say, right? Because I've been in startups for the last 13 years. So even if I'm talking to someone from engineering, I have interacted with engineers. I mean, I've hired engineers. I have sort of a context in terms of where they're coming from. So a lot of the times I'm trying to validate if my thinking is correct, and there is some scope for discovery as well, but it's a lot more validation, and it's a lot more unraveling the uh, uh, um, how should I put it? It's more unraveling one point of reference, right? So if I have something to talk about with, let's say, product or marketing, I would love to know someone's perspective on that, and then we can deep dive on that, right? Very specifically. With Bharatvarta, I have less of a context, because obviously the topics are a lot more diverse. And as much as I try to keep in, touch with various things, there is literally, like, an abundance of things that we talk about, right? So it's more of discovery and less of validation for me with Bharatvarta. And here I'm literally like a kid in a candy shop. I'm just like listening to all these fantastic people talk about these things and uh, really trying to understand things, right? And both of these from a very first principles basis, I would say. So I'd say the purpose of a podcast is to surface the best possible content about a particular thing, and really that's all I try to do with both these podcasts.
Right, right. Yeah, that explains a lot of this, and I really like your analogy comparing this being a kid in a candy store. That is basically what a lot of us are trying to do. That's pretty spot on, and uh, yeah, like you said, maybe when you get into a Bharatvaarta podcast, it's there is a lot more scope for unraveling new things, exploring topics that you really haven't thought about prior to doing an episode, right? And like I mentioned, I've listened to a couple of episodes. Even when you look at the one with uh, Amish or the one with Sridhar Vembu, uh, you tackle topics that are not mainstream. That is simply amazing because there is a lot of open-endedness to it, and you handle it with such grace. So how do you go about preparing for these topics, right? These complex ones that you probably cannot learn overnight or even over a week's time.
That's a very interesting question again, and I hope I'm able to do justice to that. You're asking a lot of good questions, man. So kudos to you as well. So, uh, see, prep for Bharatvarta is pretty simple, right? When I say simple, I mean it's not easy. Uh, so you need to have a base understanding of whatever it is you're talking about, right? So um, let's say you're talking about some new telecom policy that was introduced or whatever it is. 101 would be to understand, what the telecom policy is, what it entails, so on and so forth. Then look at some sort of precedence in terms of what has happened before. Then look at, what stakeholders are going to be impacted by it, and then so on and so forth, right? So you start from a base point and cover a reasonable surface area of this. But then what happens next is a lot more important, right? I mean, see, in a podcast it's not important what you know, right? I mean, it's important how you surface the best content. Remember that, right? So that is the thing that you're trying to optimize for. Now, you need to understand, what is your guest's area of expertise and what they feel passionately about, and try to get them to talk about that, right? So if somebody, for example, opposes the telecom policy, you have to understand why they oppose it, right? And why do they feel it's not good. Somebody else feels that no, this is the next best thing that's happened since whatever. You would like to understand more about that as well. Now, what you have in the podcast as a result of both of these is that you have, let's say, two, three, or five, 10 points for and against this, right? Now, for someone who's listening to it, he or she has an understanding of the pros and the cons. As simple as that, right? Uh, Oftentimes, I mean, I like to get into these podcasts with an absolutely open mind, right? So I'm not trying to impose my views um, on anything or anyone in particular, right? So I've spoken to people on both sides of the political aisle, and I've just been very, very cognizant of the fact that, look, it's not about me, right? I'm trying to get the best content out there, and I'm going to let people speak, right? uh, I'm more curious about why they have certain views about certain things. That's all, right? So uh, I think if you have that sort of a sincerity to the craft, then I think you will surface the best quality content out there. And it's really important to remind yourself that it's not about yourself. I mean, I do listen to some of the podcasts where I do feel like the guests are like positioning themselves a certain way. I mean, that's fine. I mean, if it works for them, then well and good. But then the way I like to approach these podcasts is as a tools for learning, right? And yeah, so that really works for me.
Yeah, I really like your approach to these things. It's especially important when running something like Bharatvaarta to not have a preconceived notion, right? You absolutely have to enter with an open mind.
Yeah, and it's not just with Bharatvaarta, right? So if I'm talking to let's say if I'm talking to a marketer on Startup Operator, it's very easy for me to impose my own perspective on, how someone should look at digital or something else, right? But again, I mean, it's useful to remind yourself that, I mean, let's try to understand from their perspective, right? Maybe you'll get to learn something. So that's really important, irrespective of what podcast you're talking about. It's a lot more obvious with Bharatvarta because, quite frankly, I don't know a lot of economics, right? I don't know a lot of policy. But then even with the startup operator, I mean, you have to kind of approach it with that mindset of, hey, I mean, what can I learn from this person? You know, so that really helps.
Your whole approach to an episode is what can I learn from this person, and then you just go about having a few pointers, if I'm getting this right.
Yeah, I mean, you tend to have certain themes that you want to explore, right? And you ask them about it, and you just go down that rabbit hole. I mean, podcasts for me are like rabbit holes. So you, nothing that is sufficiently important is less complex, right? So everything has so many facets to it, and what you do in long form conversation is simply unravel that, right? I mean, and whatever we're talking about could have been one sentence, but then we've spoken about it for the last 5-10 minutes, right? So which means that we're trying to really get to some point, right? We're getting to a point where it's crystal clear, right? And I do an hour long podcast. If you listen to someone like Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss, they're able to do 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours, right? And they're able to go into a lot more depth, right? So that's really the means of a podcast. You're trying to unravel things, you're trying to get to the bottom of things. It's not television programming that you have to wind up things in 15 minutes or 20 minutes or even 1 hour for that matter, right? You just run with the flow, and you you leave everything on the table. I mean, you get to a point of absolute truth.
Mhm. Absolutely. So I have a last one on the podcast for you. So uh, you have done a lot of episodes between Bharatvarta and Startup Operator, and so many amazing guests, right? What were some of your favorite episodes personally, and where you learned a very important lesson or a piece of conversation that will stick with you for years to come?
Well, I mean, I've done 100 plus podcasts in the last 7 months, and
Wow. Hats off to you there.
no, I mean, obviously, it's also because I have a fantastic team with me for both of these, initiatives that I run, right? Um, and every podcast really teaches me something about it, and it's also because I tend to listen to these podcasts multiple times, right? So I really try to understand some things that I didn't know before. So it would not be fair for me to um, let's say, I mean, the 3 or 4 of them, but if you were to push me, I would say the ones with Sridhar Vembu. I've done a couple of episodes with Sridhar Vembu, and he's just such an original thinker. I mean, he's someone who's not afraid to say what is on his mind, and he's just such an original thinker about things that it's absolutely delightful to talk to him. And I mean, in fact, every week we have the Startup Operator Roundup, and we have a special section in that called Vembu's Wisdom, where we pick up a thread of Sridhar Vembu's and we discuss it, right? Threadbare, so to speak. So Sridhar Vembu definitely, and then talking to Balaji Srinivasan was again a really, really, really great experience. I mean, so again, the guy is super original, super smart, and talking to him, you realize what lateral thinking really is, right? So he comes from a very different place, and he's able to ground that in reality, right? So it's not something abstract, something archaic. He's able to like wrap all of that up in a frame of reference that is relatable to you. So yeah, Balaji Srinivasan and Sridhar Vembu. I loved the one with Amish as well, Amish Tripathi. And on the startup operator side, I really liked talking to Sidhu Ponappa. Uh, I think it was one of the longer episodes we did, and trust me, I had to sort of rein in my questions and sort of end the podcast at about 90 minutes or so. uh, we had so much to talk about, and the guy has a very unique way of thinking about things. And actually, I wouldn't call it unique. I mean, he has such a classicist sort of an approach, right? I mean, he's someone who has studied things. I mean, who's not just executing off the bat, so really liked talking to Sidhu Panapa about engineering, management, and so on and so forth, and particularly because I was curious about it. So Sidhu Panapa for sure. um, yeah, I mean, those are the ones that come to mind at this point of time, but I'm sure there are, like, plenty of others I could go into if we had the time. But yeah, I mean, the guests have been absolutely fantastic. Every person that I talk to, I learn something from. And yeah, I highly recommend everyone do the same.
Definitely, I'll add the relevant conversations that you mentioned to the notes, so anyone listening this one can just jump to those right away. Before we jump into the random deck, where I ask you a bunch of unrelated questions, right? I want to finish off with a very open-ended question. What does an average week, Monday through Sunday, look like in the world of Roshan Cariappa? Handling a director's role whilst running two different podcasts and still having time to write kick-ass melodies on the side.
uh, Well, I mean, I don't have a very regimented life. In that, I mean, I like to indulge a little bit of randomness. I mean, I like what Taleb says about not having to wake up at a particular hour and be at a particular place, right? I like that. I like a little bit of randomness in my life. But although, I mean, I would say the podcasts tend to skew towards the weekend. I do a lot of podcasts on Saturday and Sunday. This is the fourth podcast for the day that I'm on
Wow.
right now.
I
Yeah.
have been preparing for this one for 2 days.
Well, I mean, you've done a lot of good homework, I should say, right? So yeah, the podcasts tend to skew a lot towards on the Saturday and Sundays. Um, Otherwise, I mean, I tend to overlap my time as much as possible with my team, and I tend to work in about 2 or 3 different time zones. So my Southeast Asia team starts up pretty early, 7:38 in the morning. Then I have the India hours, and then after that, the US team logs in at about 9 p.m. IST, right? So these are 3 different time zones that I have to sort of be cognizant of. And really, I have a fantastic team on everything that I do, right? So that's one thing that I really, really try to do, which is work with a good team. I'm not a very solo endeavor kind of a person. So I have a fantastic team at Vymo. I have a fantastic team with Bharatvaarta and Startup Operator, right? And um, it's pretty much that, I mean, they pretty much help me do whatever whatever I'd like to do, and I haven't done a lot of music this year, although I wanted to record an album. I've been writing something for a while. I haven't done anything musical this year, but I'd love to put out an album maybe by 2020, 2021. That would be nice. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So uh, I do have a lot of Zoom calls during the day, I mean, so that is one thing that I could do less of. I'd love to meet people in person, really. But hey, I mean, I'm trying to make the best of
Right.
whatever we have.
Absolutely. So let's jump into random deck. The questions are random. I might increase my pace of asking them in a way. I know I asked a lot of open-ended and questions, and most of them run close to about a minute when I ask the usual questions. These are very short ones, but feel free to take your time and be as elaborate as you can with the answers. We'll start off with what is an absolute non-negotiable for you in life?
Uh, Non-negotiable for me in life, integrity, man. I think it's really important to have some sort of integrity in your life. A lot of integrity in your life. It just makes a lot of things simpler. Uh, you know, it makes your life simple. It makes lives of people around you simple. Just don't play games. Don't fool yourself. Apply that Feynman principle, uh, and respect integrity. Really, as Nawal says,
Right.
you only have to play long-term games with long-term players, right? So find yourself that sort of world within worlds that you can live in, and yeah, respect integrity.
Amazing. I noticed you bringing up Navalaka 3, 4 times. So,
Yeah.
who's your dream guest on the podcast? Is it
uh,
Balaji or
Yeah, I'd love to interview Nawal someday. I'd love to talk to Nawal someday. I just hope that I can measure up to him in terms of being a good host. So he is just fantastic. I mean, he's one of those guys who's got a very Zen-like aura to him, everything he says, and uh, I really, really appreciate the stuff that he puts out.
Yeah, and I was listening to the Tim Ferriss one yesterday as well. It was a it basically crushed my heart when he said at the beginning he's not planning to do any more podcasts.
He-
So,
yeah, but who knows? Who knows? Someday maybe he can come on our podcast.
so I sort of pushed you to answer Napal for that one, but feel free to bring up other names that you had in mind.
Nawal, Tim Ferriss, those would be the podcast guys. I also like Shane Parrish with the Knowledge Project, right? Yeah, and I listen to Brown Pundits. They also run a pretty nice, Southeast Asia sort of
Mhm.
based podcast on a lot of cultural issues, social issues. I get to know a lot of different facets of various societies in Asia and so on. So that is something that I would say. And then my friend JPK runs the Use Case podcast, which is also something I recommend. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, these are the ones that I can immediately recall. There's a friend of mine, Devaya, who also runs who's part of a startup called All Things Small, and they have a couple of very good podcasts as well that you should definitely check out. Mm, yeah, those are the podcast guys that I can think of, and the ones you should definitely follow. uh, Aside from that, in terms of just general people that I regard highly and that I respect and so on, definitely Nassim Taleb. um, I was just saying this on a different podcast. I think there are two me's, one before Taleb and one after my discovery of Taleb. uh, so Nassim Taleb for sure, Jordan Peterson for sure. These are a couple of people that I really respect, and whose thoughts have really influenced everything that I do. Um, mm, yeah, those are the ones that I can think of at this point of time.
Uh, I'll jump to the next one here. What's your favorite word in English? Now, aside from
Yes.
integrity, S.
Yeah. So I'm, I mean, it's every salesperson's, every business person's favorite word, right? Getting to a yes. So I'd say yes. And also, I mean, it's also a very positive and sort of an optimistic thing, in a world that sort of I won't say respects doom and gloom, but is replete with doom and gloom. I mean, it's good to have people who say yes and who jump on board on things and who are more positive and optimistic about things.
Right. Say yes and then figure out how to do it.
Pretty much.
So, you are in your 30s, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm allowed to say that. So,
Yeah,
what's
the
an
game's up.
uh, so what is an advice that you would have given your 17-year-old self?
Ah, I don't think my 17-year-old self would have listened to the advice that I'm giving, so it's kind of a moot point. I think Look, I think people tend to think of themselves as unique, and I would say yes, your problems are unique, but they're also not so unique. I mean, there've been billions of people who existed on the earth before, and much as you try to think of yourself as unique, there are also a lot of things that people have gone through, very similar to what you have gone through. So it really makes sense to read a lot about these things, to understand a lot about these things. So you have some sort of a frame of reference. I mean, you still have to fight these battles yourself. There's no amount of knowledge that will transform instantly into wisdom. Wisdom comes from experience. It comes from doing things yourself. But I do believe that being aware of certain things, being aware of certain people in your life, being aware of all of these things changes your mindset, changes your mode of thinking. And I would say maybe just be a little more self-aware. Maybe understand why you tend to feel a certain way about certain things, and uh, not really bounce off of one emotion to another. Because I'm also a very passionate person, so I tend to have my highs and lows. And one of the things that I've learned is to be really self-aware of my emotions, and to figure out why I'm reacting to a certain thing, a particular way.
So, running down the clock a bit, what is it you wish you would be known for when you're 70, 70?
The most interesting 70-year-old.
Nice, good one. So, what is a good habit that you are trying to work into your life, and what is a bad habit you're trying to get rid of?
uh, the good habit that I'm trying to work into my life, well, mm, I would say I'd love to read more. I mean, all of this year I've been trying to read more and more. I mean, I've got a stack of books that I want to complete, right? And you know, uh, I am trying to, I am trying to. The problem with reading for me is that I tend to pause a lot. I tend to absorb a lot. I tend to make notes a lot. So, so it isn't usually like a page to page to page kind of a experience for me. So I tend to read and reread a lot. So it slows down my pace of reading. But I really have to make more time. I mean, I read before I nod off to bed in the night, and yeah, I would say, I mean, we should I would love to make more time for reading. One of the things that as I mentioned earlier as well, over the last 3-4 years that I've been trying to do is make those difficult choices proactively. And those could be many different things, right? Those could be maybe building more muscle, for example. Uh, um, you know, uh, yeah, I'm just trying to make more of those difficult choices proactively, rather than being thrust upon a circumstance where I have to do that, right? So um, being aware of what I consume, um, you know even like knowledge and stuff like that, right? Or even information and so on. Being really aware of what I'm consuming, and having a way to regulate what I consume, I think is important. Being mindful, all of those things, all of the good stuff. I mean, I'm just trying to get more of that in my life. um, Bad habit that I'm trying to get rid of, checking my phone soon as I wake up. Yeah, so that is one thing that I'm trying to get rid of. I had gotten rid of it, but then, I mean, it's somehow clawed back into my life. But yeah, I would love to not have to see the phone when I wake up.
Speaking of books, if you could give one book to every person in your network, which book would you gift?
Skin in the Game. No brainer at all. Skin
Nassim
in the
Taleb.
Game by Nicholas Nassim Taleb. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, yeah.
That is the exact book that Sahiba from Hello Mates had mentioned. So that's been
Oh,
on
okay.
my wish list for quite some time, and I think I'm gonna go ahead and start reading that book. All of you
Sure.
keep mentioning that, and so you've had a lot of guests on your podcast, and you
Hmm.
have been on my podcast now, so you know how this one works. So, what if you could nominate one guest or one person from your network to come on the Takeaway Club? Who would that be?
That's such a difficult question. I think you should talk to Gunjan Saha, who works with me on the Startup Operator, right, and who also works with me on, in Vymo. Um, I think you should definitely talk to him, try to understand how he does all of those various things that he does. He's definitely an interesting person to talk to.
If there was a billboard in every town in the world and you get to decide what goes on in the billboard, what would it say?
Gosh, man, I mean, that's a heck of a responsibility. To be honest, I mean, I wouldn't want to say anything because I wouldn't know the consequence of that, right? Um, Yeah, that literally is what social media is. I mean, I tweeted about this some time back. It's you really have to be cognizant about what you're putting out there. Not just from your perspective, but on from the perspective of someone reading it as well. You don't know what the mindset is of someone who's reading it. I mean, if they've had a bad day, if they've had a terrible fight just before they saw that, or if they're feeling a certain way. I mean, really, we just have to be more cognizant of it. I mean, it's not so obvious to us that social media is sort of a megaphone, so we tend to abuse it. I mean, we tend to put out every kind of content out there, right? But yeah, I mean, it you really have to be mindful about it. So if you ask me what is it that I would put on a billboard, I would say be kinder. Be kinder to everyone.
So, the last question before we wrap this up, if you were Krishna, what is something that you would have asked Roshan Cariappa that I missed out in the conversation?
Well, uh, I can't think of much, man. I mean, you did a bang up job in this podcast. I mean, you covered everything, right? So there's literally nothing I can think of. So fantastic work, Krishna. You've been a fantastic podcast host. And I have some credibility in saying that because I host a podcast myself.
Thank you.
I hope I
And
host a couple of podcasts. So good work. And there's literally nothing that I can think of that you haven't covered. So
thank
fantastic.
you for the kind words, but that is not entirely true. I know we didn't really dive deep into your fitness rituals or your fasting.
Oh yeah.
So
Oh
that.
yeah, we didn't talk about the fasting. That's right. But I think you know what? I think you should talk to this guy called Senpai Jagajit on Twitter.
Uh-huh.
Uh, so he would be a fantastic guest on your show. I mean, he could talk about fitness and fasting and all of those other things. Um, yeah, he's one of those credible voices on health and fitness on Twitter.
Wow. Thank you, Roshan. Thank you for such a well-rounded conversation. I mean, looking back at where we started and how this has turned out to be, I'm really happy and thank you, man. You're someone I look up to. Maybe I think that's what I want to get on the record before we go off air. Seriously, I mean, I looked up to you when I didn't know you at all, and knowing you and having interacted with you, the respect has only gone up. You know.
Thank you, man. I mean, you're being way too kind, and I hope people listening to it don't take you too seriously on this front. It puts a lot of pressure on me, but yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much about that.
Thank you so much for listening to the episode. If you like the conversation, please share it with your network or good friends who would enjoy this. And consider subscribing to the Takeaway Club podcast on your music streaming platforms or YouTube so you don't miss out on new episodes. And if you're listening to this conversation on Apple Podcast, it would be amazing if you can rate the podcast or leave a review, which goes a long way in helping other podcast listeners find the show. I'll see you soon with a brand new episode. Until then, stay safe and take care.